All right, welcome to part two. I was unaware that I had a 15-minute window that I can record these. So hopefully I can piece them together on YouTube so that you don't have to go to more than one video. However, so we were talking about monoculture. We're talking about the industrialization of crops. Basically, like you've got this like factory strategy. You've got one single crop. It's super, efficient. The major goal is just a steady increase of crop yield, and we talked about that's a linear growth relationship. Um, but this industrialized agriculture does come with some difficulties that we'll talk about in a minute. Another type of industrialized crop production um, would be plantation agriculture. This is where you have some kind of cash crop, something that's like really high value. So the biggest, newest one for us here in the United States is hemp. One of those cash crops, let's say like in Mexico, is the agave, because the production of tequila. Classically in the South it was cotton. Classically in the South it was tobacco, and there are other places where, let's say, like sugar. These are the cash crops that you're going to use to like trade for other goods from other countries, and that becomes a commodity. So that being said, so here's a picture of what you might think of as farming now, right? Like when you think, well, we think of the farm as like this little idyllic place where you've got a bunch of different types of animals and maybe you're growing different types of crops. That's homesteading. Really, what farming now is an industrial process. This is a harvester that's in the Midwest of the United States is pulling. This is wheat that it's harvesting right now. So you have this really heavy equipment. It has a large amount of seeds and it manufactures. There's a lot of manufactured inorganic fertilizers and fossil fuels that are used to actually process this crop. And I mean, it's effective, that's for sure. This is why we are a society that has grown in population, because we can feed ourselves. Traditional agriculture often relies on what we call it's a low input polyculture, um, meaning like there's many different things that you are like growing at a time. So traditional subsistence agriculture relies on human labor, that you have animals, and it's really just to grow food for your family. Traditional intensive culture maybe get a higher yield through increased labor using animal manure and water. But these are still within like the homesteading realm. This is not an industrial process. All right, and then the last piece is polyculture, and that you have several crops that are grown on the same farm. And there are a lot of benefits for that over monoculture. So, what we're looking at now within this transition of time where we realize like industrialized use of land isn't necessarily the most sustainable use. Like, obviously, there's going to need to be some changes. So, not relying so heavily on inorganic fertilizers and things, and pesticides and things, because there's like some very clear consequences for the health of our, not just our bodies as humans, but also for the health of the ecosystem surrounding us. And so, I know we talked about the fish kills this last week, the dead zone, in at the mouth of particular rivers that are entering into the Gulf of Mexico. You have these large areas where synthetic fertilizers are coming in, and causing a lot of problems. So we know that there are problems with just that industrial process of food production, and then there's better ways that have less of an impact. And somehow we need to merge those two. So there needs to be some really innovative technological advances that are going to shift from, like, this is like low energy, low economy input for a large output in terms of like that's industrial agriculture. So we're going to have to kind of like shave off a little bit of the profit margin in order to invest back into maintaining a healthy environment. We have to be at a place where what we're doing is sustainable, and we really sometimes in our society really sacrifice a lot for what we would refer to as the bottom line. So this is something that needs to be addressed within this particular industry, and it's a repeating issue from from the three different industries that we're going to talk about here. So organic agriculture is that promise that crops can be grown without synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, that there's no genetically engineered seed varieties, and that animals can be raised on organic feed without antibiotics or growth hormones. It just is more labor intensive than conventionally produced food. So therefore, like that labor has to be paid for. So it costs more to purchase and it costs more to produce. But there are a lot of people that believe that this is a good place to be. So here's a little comparison. Just taking a look at industrialized agriculture versus organic. I don't even know where to put this, so it's out of the way. Organic agriculture. In industrialized agriculture, we have synthetic, so it's produced inorganic fertilizer, sewage sludge, and that's used to supply the plant nutrients. It can make use of synthetic chemical pesticides as well. It often does. Unless there's a ban on it at that point. Uses conventional and genetically modified seeds both. It depends on non-renewable fossil fuels, produces significant air and water pollution and greenhouse gases, is globally export oriented. So it's not about the local economy or the local space. It's about taking products and like I was talking about this. Like if you go to the grocery store, you're going to see a lot of imported foods, a lot of imported produce. So coming from different countries like Chile, coming from Mexico. Just take a look at produce and see where it's from. They will use antibiotics and growth hormones to produce meat and meat products within the meat production part of things. Organic is definitely better for the environment, and these are all the benefits, right? But there is a cost factor to it. And so we have a place that we have to find where we're going to land as a society, because there's a lot of people in the world that, like we said, we're living in poverty. They are not going to be able to afford the luxury of better food production unless the world that is developed takes that cost on and makes this the norm. So, got some things to. All right, we talked about the Green Revolution already. That there, it really did save a lot of lives, but at the expense of some ecology. And so we've got that to deal with now. The second Green Revolution refers to this fast-growing varieties of rice and wheat that we now see in production. Between 1950 and 2014, there's been a lot of scientific development of our grains, and that has really given a lot of food opportunity to the world that didn't have it, because grains keep for a long time, and they produce food that is highly nutritious, dense in calories, and really convenient to get into people's bodies, right? So, and into that production chain. Let me take a look at what is next up here. Okay, so you can see the growth in worldwide grain production of wheat, corn, and rice in a per capita comparison between 1950 and 2015. So, why do you think grain productions per capita has grown less consistently than the total grain production? I want you to think about what we talked about, the relationship between population and the growth curve that we see in population and the growth relationship that happens within food. Okay. Another case study is taking a look at industrialized food production in the United States. Agribusiness is what is just a few giant multinational corporations that are really in control of the growing, processing, and distribution and the sale of food. Food production is very, very efficient. Americans spend 9% of their income on food. The actual cost of food is much higher. There's hidden costs, though, that are picked up by government subsidies. There is a lot of pollution and there's a lot of environmental degradation that isn't accounted for in terms of the cost that comes to us. So we talked about full cost pricing at the beginning of the term in dealing with like what does that look like? What does that mean? It means that the costs of mitigating pollution, the costs of the environmental degradation and the use of the land and the ecosystem services that a natural ecosystem would provide, that somehow that needs to be written into the cost of the food itself. Another topic, crossbreeding and genetic engineering needs to be talked about. We know that I know I explained genetic engineering a little bit already and what a GMO actually is, and I encourage you to dig into this a little bit deeper. I know that some of you, in particular, were very interested in this topic, especially if you're taking bio. It's a good thing to kind of dive into because it will help you understand the genetic process. But crossbreeding and genetic engineering produce new varieties of crops and livestock, and then we see this. The crazy thing is, like, you have this natural process, and we're kind of, playing with the natural progression of evolution to a level that we have to use the lab, a scientific lab with genetic processes that have come out of a highly um, scientific process, a highly lab-driven process, and that's transferring over to something that sometimes we perceive as like a natural process, but we've taken agricultural processes and we've we've taken them way out of the natural context. So the first gene revolution, crossbreeding through artificial selection. This is a slow process. This is what we've done though. We've picked things that we like and we breed them, and we got amazing results from that. And then the second gene revolution we would refer to as the GMO generation, so genetic engineering, where this is where we're actually altering organisms' DNA. We use some of the processes that are natural, that bacteria and viruses can introduce segments of DNA into the actual genome of organisms. Well, we can control that and we play with it, and we've got some really cool results from it, but we've got some unintended consequences from this as well. It's not all a happy story. Um, but that you'll have to kind of dig into on your own. Okay, so let's talk about meat consumption. We talked about crop production. Now let's talk about meat production. Meat production has increased more than sixfold between 1950 and 2010. Now, meat is a highly nutritious food, right? And a lot of times in traditional human societies, a lot of what we did was trap and hunt and process and sometimes even preserve meat products because they're so nutrient dense, and there's things that we need from meat that we can't get um, from just like plant-based diets. Not, or we can, but we have to have so much or just the right types of plants introduced into the diet. Whereas, like, because we are omnivores, the meat production part of things does satisfy biological needs for us. But meat production, we'll look at pork, poultry, and beef. Those are the top products. And because those are the top products, then there's an increased demand for grain because that is what feeds pork, poultry, and beef. So pigs, chickens, turkeys, and um, cattle, they we feed them grain because that's a really measurable, consistent diet. It's not necessarily what they would eat in nature, but it's also a very convenient way for us to fatten them up and get them ready to be, you know, processed, and basically they are a food product. About half of the world's meat is raised on rangelands and half is done in factory farm systems, and so that's going to be all grain fed. Meat consumption looks like this. Global meat production has steadily increased, and you can see um, here though that there's a big shift in terms of where meat is being produced most. So the United States is still growing, but globally the majority of that growth has happened in China. This is a feedlot. I'm guessing, let me see if it tells me where this is. This is a feedlot in Arizona, actually. So this is it looks very similar to some of the ones we have here in California. Um, but this is what industrialized meat production looks like and smells like. And there's a lot of issues with taking animals that um, would never naturally live in this dense of a situation on their own, and then holding them in a space where so they're all